All right. This is Free Radical Media, podcast number 7. Today we're going to be talking about Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition and its inspiration on history and the Renaissance. For those of you not familiar, Giordano Bruno was a Dominican friar, philosopher, mathematician, poet, scientist, and astrologer. We recently celebrated his anniversary of his death on February 17th of 1600. Personally, Bruno is a hero to me because he is the perfect icon of someone who went outside the confined boundaries of ideology and came to his own conclusions, and because of that pissed a lot of people off and was subsequently burned at the stake by the Catholic Church. Very interesting character. I recommend anyone listening to really do a little bit of research on Bruno. I think he's sort of like the perfect archetype of the Renaissance man. So what do you guys think?
Bruno was certainly one of the more interesting figures in the Renaissance. Extremely intellectual, well-read, very widely traveled. He traveled throughout Europe, into Britain, Germany, engaging with other intellectual figures in the Renaissance. The guy was really interesting, and he was right about a lot of things.
Mm-hmm. One of the things he beautifully sort of states is how, the stars in the sky are other suns. He was a big believer in the Copernican theory of heliocentrism, and he believed, and this was taking it a step further from Copernicus, obviously, that the stars in the sky were actually themselves other suns, and around those other suns were other planets with other forms of life on it. And that was a pretty much unheard of idea at that time. Not many people were talking about that, and if people did believe that, they were probably petrified to come out about something like that.
Absolutely.
But even today, in our era, our science is still sort of reluctant to admit that fact that these other solar systems, planets, may actually have life. So it's still taboo even today,
right,
to say that there's planets with life on it, and that the universe is indeed infinite with infinite life. So
yeah, it's certainly especially for 1500 CE. It's a profoundly radical idea. Bruno's conception of cosmology went beyond Copernicus. Included all these things, and obviously he's been proven right. We know our sun is just another star. Other planets orbit other stars. These things have been proven. It's just interesting at the time that he was able to conceive of those ideas.
Very interesting indeed, and I personally think it had something to do with the various philosophies he was dabbling in besides Copernicism. He was very much involved with the Hermeticism and even bits and pieces of Kabbalah. Although I think Hermeticism was really his forte. Very much sort of the inspiration behind a lot of the alchemical thinking of that era. So I think that's sort of all tied into his conception that the universe is indeed infinite. If you're going to worship an infinite God, it's only logical to say that the God's universe, is infinite also, right?
Sure.
The whole point of Hermeticism was that the universe is a reflection, or like an emanation, or like a platonic shadow of God. And if your God is infinite, and the universe is a shadow of it, then the shadow itself logically would have to be infinite.
Right. And the major ideas, like during this period in the Renaissance, were Hermeticism and Neoplatonism,
right,
which are pretty complementary in a lot of ways. So you do have that Platonic emanation shadow theory that that runs into this, significantly older Hermetic tradition. Pico de Mirandola, another philosopher at the time, made an effort to reconcile the Jewish Kabbalah with Christian mysticism and Hermeticism, right? Mm. So he was trying to synthesize, the two ideas. What a lot of people during this time thought was that this figure, Hermes, was supposedly a pagan foreshadowing of the Christian tradition, right? So during the Renaissance, a lot of these people were saying that all the old philosophies from the pagans were anticipating Christian dogma, right? So they would take Aristotle and they would take Plato and they would say, well, this anticipates what our cosmology looks like in the Christian era, right? So that's how they could rationalize using
and to sort of get it accepted by the church.
Right, exactly, yeah. And in some cases it worked, and in some cases people got burned at the stake. Right. That's... what did you say the other day, Jay? Heresy, it's all fun and games until somebody gets burned at the stake.
Yeah, something like that. It's true, though. And actually, it's funny because when Bruno, when he was talking about Copernicus, that really wasn't what did him in. It was when he had the dream of seeing the universe. He saw our sky in almost like a snow globe type of deal where it was a dome, and he pushed it away. And when he lifted up the veil, he saw the entire universe, and he started floating through the universe, and that's when he realized how vast the universe was. And then when he told this idea to other people involved in the church and things like that, that's really what made people go over the edge and say that he was speaking heresy against the church. And
I actually have a list of charges in front of me. I'd like to pick a few of them out. He was charged and tried in Rome in 1593. It was a 7-year trial, this process, apparently. But some of the charges: holding opinions contrary to the Catholic faith and speaking against it and its ministers. I assume this stems from not only his Hermetic views, but spending time with Lutherans in Germany, Protestantism. Holding opinions contrary to the Catholic faith about the Trinity, the divinity of Christ, and incarnation. Holding opinions contrary to the Catholic faith pertaining to Jesus as Christ, that's Jesus as the Savior. Holding opinions contrary to Catholic faith regarding the virginity of Mary, mother of Jesus, questioning the virgin birth. Holding opinions contrary to the Catholic faith about both transubstantiation and Mass. Now, that's transubstantiation in the Catholic sense is the idea that the Eucharist, the wafer, is literally transformed into the body and blood of Christ. That's the Christian dogma. It is literally transformed through holy intercession into the body and blood of Christ. He denied this. That was a big charge at the time. Claiming the existence of plurality of worlds and their eternity. Now there we go.
Yeah.
The existence of a plurality of worlds and their eternity. So that that would seem to challenge Genesis. That God made Earth especially to be the center of the universe, right? So that challenges that whole worldview. And dealing in magics and divination. So witchcraft.
Yeah, so he had balls. He definitely had balls to go on a speaking tour throughout Europe spouting these ideas.
Right. Writing quite a lot. The guy defended himself for 7 years, in open court. So,
one of the interesting things that the church often uses as sort of an excuse, they say, well, we gave him multiple chances to refute what he was saying. But if you hold these beliefs, they're your beliefs. You shouldn't be forced to change your beliefs just because they go against the common ideas. It's like when we were talking earlier about the idea of when people thought the world was flat. I mean, not many people thought that, but the people who thought it were all gung ho about it. I mean, it was later found to not be true. Well, in the case of Bruno, it was later found that he was right. Too often, I think, in our history, we see multiple accounts of people jumping the gun on other people's ideas and trying to attack them without really having any sort of facts to back them. And then, it turns out, and we lost a great mind probably at least a few years before he probably would have died if that wouldn't have happened. But
yeah. It's unfortunate. It's an example of censorship.
And it goes on today. We're not burning people at the stake, obviously, but if you're an academic and you go against the popular academic opinions, you'll be ostracized.
Yes, you will be. And you could be denied grant money. You could be denied positions at universities. Academia it's pretty insular.
Yeah, no doubt about it. One of the things I found interesting about Bruno and that whole era was they had this idea of like a golden age from the quote-unquote Egyptian past, and it was through the uncovering of the Hermetica or the Hermetic texts that Bruno especially thought Egypt was this like sort of golden age of humanity, and we were sort of like uncovering the remnants of this lost religious knowledge that we had sort of forgotten or had been suppressed by the church or whatever you want to think about it. But modern, and to be completely honest with you, I'm still don't know exactly how this unfolded, because apparently modern archaeological evidence says that there's no way the Hermetic texts are as old as Bruno and the people in the Renaissance thought they were.
Right.
But then I could have sworn I remember reading that actually we think, and they had uncovered some sort of vase or something. I don't know if it was involved with the Nag Hammadi library or what, but they had uncovered some parchments that indeed the Hermetic texts are actually older. Not as old as Bruno thought they were, but they are older than the revised date.
Right.
So I don't know what you guys think about that.
What's interesting with these kind of things, like it's something that's really important in religious, spiritual, philosophical senses, is this idea of transmission, right? So basically the idea is that the earlier an idea goes back, the more validity it has. Right. So you see that. You even see that in just like Christianity. Christ descended from the line of David, going back to Noah, Moses, Abraham, and from Abraham to Adam in the garden. So you have this idea of transmission. Well, you've got all these groups who were using these philosophies, and they were attempting to point to, well, this came from, the ancient philosophical schools of Greece or Egypt, or Persia, and it's curious because you do find similarities in those things too. Even in the Vedas, there's similarities to the Hermetic writings. In the Vedas, those are very, very old.
Right.
So it's hard to pinpoint where did this come from? Where did this come from? When everybody has these differing ideas.
Because from what I gathered, I think the consensus among the modern historical view is that Hermeticism was really just sort of a conglomerate of Platonism and the Old Testament and bits and pieces of Christianity.
Right.
But to me, I don't know, I'm no historian, but I sort of feel like it makes sense to say that possibly Plato and Pythagoras, because Pythagoras did study in Egypt, right?
Yeah.
In the mystery schools.
Right. He founded a mystery school.
Right. That they would have adopted these beliefs from the Egyptians. I sort of find it hard to believe that the Egyptians didn't have their own deeper sense of esoteric sort of mysticism.
Yeah, and they did, it seems like. And certainly, Greece and Egypt, there's a great deal of contact.
Right.
And they did influence each other. even before, Egypt was ruled by Greeks,
Right.
But yeah, certainly there are parallels, And I do believe that Hermeticism comes from earlier pagan traditions. I do believe that. And then it was adapted into Christian mysticism by guys like Pico de Mirandola, Giordano Bruno, Ficino.
And it possibly adopted into the Greek thought, using, instead of using Thoth, using Hermes, right? I mean, very interesting, very, very mysterious and very interesting. And even the similarities between Hermes and Moses is fascinating to me.
Yeah, and even some people said that Hermes was Moses. Some people say he's in the same. They put him in the same bloodline as Moses. But everyone agrees that he was this pagan philosopher that anticipated, the Christian idea of Christian Hermeticism.
Right.
I guess there's a distinction that should be made there. But yeah, interesting figure. The thing is, a lot of times, especially with Hermeticism, later occultists, transformed it into the Thoth idea, right? So they wanted to trace it back to Egypt, whereas in the Renaissance, it was far better for their purposes to trace it back to Rome and Greece. Right, because then you also got the connection with the Roman Empire. You got those, Hellenistic connections. Because in the Renaissance, you always wanted to connect things to those civilizations, because it gave legitimacy to the European structures that existed at the time.
Right.
The Holy Roman Empire, the papacy.
If I remember correctly, when the Renaissance was going on, they were translating the old books. Hermes Trismegistus books were made a priority.
Yeah,
to
over
Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah.
So that kind of speaks to how highly they held him in their views of his views. But yeah, there's a lot of theories behind him, but obviously it's a lot of hearsay, a lot of loose ideas, loose facts. But interesting stuff nonetheless.
Interesting and extremely poetic. I mean, if you've ever read bits and pieces of the Hermetica, it's obviously the wisdom in it is incredible, but just the structure of the language is has a very poetic nature to it. And it reminds me, a lot of it does remind me of the Old Testament, even Genesis. They call it it's like the first book in the Hermetica called the Pymander, where Hermes is in contact with God or the All, and it's explaining to Hermes the nature of how reality structures itself, that everything is a reflection of the All. You could find the All in everything in nature. And it sounds Platonic. It most definitely has a Platonic sound to it, but it's Platonic, but at the same time it's deeply mystical.
It has a Taoist sense to it.
Taoist, yeah, and like we were saying earlier,
yeah.
even sort of like a Vedic sense, profound knowledge, no doubt about it.
I mean, that's one of the ideas of Hermeticism, though, is this concept that. That golden thread that unites all religion, that there are basic spiritual truths which underlie all conceptions of religiosity, right? So, I mean, that's part of it there. And it is, it was heavily Neoplatonic. A lot of these it's interesting that a lot of these thinkers, Mirandola, Bruno, even Isaac Newton, they were all heavily into Hermeticism. They were heavily into mysticism as well as ancient philosophy. These people were, Renaissance men,
right?
Trying to conduct, scientific experimentation, philosophical experimentation, and also had this very deep mystic sense that oftentimes counteracted established religious views.
Right. And it was almost like this religious impulse that put them, that inspired them to do science, right? Because I've heard it said before that even in the Middle Ages, it was sort of deemed demonic or black magic to take any sort of religious idea and to sort of apply it onto the world in front of you. Like that was deemed like you're going against God's will when you do something like that. But when we came across Hermeticism, it flipped. All of a sudden we had permission. Well, if this is all God, then it's natural for us to want to explore it and get deeper into it and explore God's laws.
Yeah.
You know, so we weren't going against God's will. We weren't, you know, there was nothing, and I mean, obviously that wasn't completely true because, I mean, there were obviously boundaries you couldn't cross.
Or you would be burned at the stake.
But I think there was a lot more freedom due to that mystical ideology of, you know, if everything's God, then why not explore it? Why not, you know, have some fun with it and experiment with it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, you know, the only time that this could have happened, you know, during this period was the Renaissance. Mm. You know, it was just that all these factors came together to allow that kind of discourse to happen in Europe, especially in Italy, and then spreading into Germany and Britain and, you know, the Low Countries. You know, we usually date the Renaissance around Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy.
Okay.
You know, when he was writing that's when we'd say that the early Renaissance was beginning. And, you know, in the Divine Comedy, you have, you know, Dante taking Virgil, an ancient poet, you know, Roman poet, is his guide through hell and purgatory, you know, and then he goes into paradise. So you have this very strange religious document that doesn't have anything to do with the church, right? It's purely literary, really. Right. Although it was, you know, accepted by the church. But it was the first time anybody had really undertaken something, you know, of that nature that kind of opened the doors to a conversation.
Right.
You know, and then, of course, you had Petrarch and others translating, you know, these works, you know, these Hermetic works, Aristotle, you know, works on geometry and architecture and art. Right. You know, and you just had all these advancements coming from this knowledge that seemed to have just been locked away for centuries.
Right.
God, I just lost my thought.
It's interesting too because if you think back, I mean, I know there's writers like Graham Hancock or some of these Egyptologists that sort of think that the Egyptian Empire was way older and way more advanced than is typically accepted. I always have this sort of hunch, like perhaps we're on the brink of even going and uncovering an even more ancient knowledge, you know, something that had been lost even way before what we would call, what we have an idea of as, you know, prehistory or the beginning of history or whatever. Right. Something that would really sort of make us completely not only rewrite history, but question the very fabric of life itself.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, the problem is, again, within academic circles, you have these established norms, right? And somebody challenges those, they get a lot of resistance, even if they have good evidence. Yeah. They get a lot of resistance, you know, and it's just like Bruno, really. It's that kind of academic censorship, right, that violates the status quo. You know, I mean, if you look at history, the entirety of it is open to interpretation, and half of it's a lie. You know, it's just basically our perception of history. We project our own perception of events onto the historical record. You know, I mean, we go back and we get evidence from societies and things. Some of it's conflicting. You know, some of it's very challenging to the accepted narrative of human history. You know, I think it's important that you pay attention to those things and look at those things because, you know, you can't always trust your textbooks. You know, I mean, hell, 50 years ago, you read a textbook about Columbus, and here was this great, conquering hero discovering the new world, really, but we realized from his journals, I mean, the guy was a murderer and a rapist, and didn't really discover anything.
Well, hell, 100 years ago, not even 100 years ago, there were books that said if you educated women, that it would they wouldn't be able to be pregnant, if it would do something to their menstrual cycle if you educated them. But really, I mean, it is completely ludicrous. Our idea of history, our modern idea of history, didn't start until what, the 1500s, or late 1400s.
That's what we consider the modern period, from around 1492 to.
So really, everything before that is what we would deem a myth. To a degree, it's obviously the farther you go back, the more it is a myth, or some sort of mythos. That's one of the things about the Bible. I mean, it's not a literal interpretation. There weren't stenographers there taking notes at all these events that are described. They're described third-party source, and the first book of the Bible was written 60 years or 40 years after Christ's death.
The first gospel.
First gospel,
yeah. I actually think it's a little longer. I think it's about 100 years.
Was it 100?
Yeah, a little less than that, maybe 80 to 90. But yeah, that's the trouble you have with a lot of these things. The early Greeks had some really good historians. Herodotus is basically seen as like the first real historian because he was actually trying to document events. But you always have bias. Even today you have bias, but historians try to avoid overt biases in their work, although you can never free yourself entirely from bias. But the historical record in the Torah, the Old Testament, for example, I mean, it's flawed because it's written from the perspective of people in one society, from their point of view. Right? So, plus it was rewritten and rewritten and rewritten as time went on. And that's the problem you have with a lot of historical documents, primary source documents, and especially the earlier you go back, the less reliable those sources are. I mean, that's why we use archaeology for the earliest civilizations, like the Harappan civilization in India and Pakistan, Mesopotamia, even Egypt. But as we can see there, that's very controversial.
Yeah.
So,
and like you said earlier, it was through transmission that these stories were transferred. At least originally, especially, it was through the mythos. It wasn't, our idea of literal or myth wasn't as much of a dichotomy in these ancient civilizations. It was probably much more effective to teach a group of people or an individual through myth rather than trying to put together some sort of literal account. Instilling it in a myth, in a sense, sort of makes it timeless.
Sure.
So, I mean, there's a great deal that could be learned from the myths. And, how much you want to take literally or not, that's up to question. But as far as wisdom, I think there's a tremendous amount. I definitely don't think we should just write them off because they're quote-unquote myths, I think that's extremely ignorant.
No, absolutely. I mean, I totally agree with that. There's a great deal to be learned from ancient wisdom. I mean, these are our stories. They belong to the collective of humanity. I mean, these are things that were important to our ancestors that kind of make our societies what they are, or make our cultures what they are. I mean, it's important to look at them and analyze them.
Yeah, I mean, the myths, they might not be literal, but there's a lot of metaphors inside of them. There's a lot of ways in which you can live your life in a lot of these stories. Very interesting. A lot of the old stories are really fascinating. The ancient Egyptian stories are fascinating. Actually, what's really interesting about Egypt is, when we think of myth in the sense of early European, the Middle East, even into India as well, Egypt is actually the polar opposite. They're the one exception of myths. Their myths in a lot of ways are the opposite. One of the things about Mother Earth and Father Sky in Egypt is the opposite. There's a lot of differences in Egyptian myth. I think that's what's so fascinating about Egypt is, and obviously they predated Greece, but there's a lot of interesting stories in Egyptian folklore and mythos that are really fascinating. The story of Thoth is fascinating, which like we were saying earlier, some people talk about how Hermes and Thoth have a lot of similarities. Some people say they were the same person.
Crowley was really into that. Yeah.
But nonetheless, the stories of Egypt are fascinating. In fact, we were talking about it earlier. Who was the leader of Egypt who made Atem, the brief one creator god?
Akhenaten.
I don't know if that is the first time in our recorded history where there was during that time where it was considered one god as the ruler god like that.
I believe that the Zoroastrians had their single god monotheistic concept before.
They were predated?
I think so, yeah. But, obviously, I'd have to check the date on that, but I'm pretty sure that the Zoroastrians did predate. Although, that's a weird monotheism because it's really a duality. It's their god, but then there was a equal, opposite devil figure in Zoroastrianism. So it's kind of a dualistic thing, but it's considered monotheistic because they only worshipped the one god.
Yeah, it was Ahura Mazda. Was the god that they worship. Which the Zoroastrians they influenced obviously Judaism and Christianity and Islam as well to a certain degree. I don't remember if they were if they predated. It was actually it could have been right around the same time that those two were together.
It's Zoroastrianism. We date it to around the 7th century BCE.
Okay.
And Akhenaten, I'll check on that as well. And I actually don't know how far back that god goes.
So Atem?
Yeah, Aten. Yeah.
That was actually, if I remember correct, Ra was the original sun god, and then Aten came later. I don't know if he was the one to instill him, if he was around before he became the ruler. But Ra was the original sun god, and he was a derivative of Ra.
Yeah.
I'm not 100% though. Another interesting part about Egypt is that every single one of those gods at one point or another is considered the creator god.
Yeah.
Which is kind of, it's really it's based on who was the pharaoh at the time. A lot of them would change certain things and label certain gods as being having certain abilities that they didn't have in previous pharaohs. Fascinating. It's a fascinating history of the Egyptian people.
You're right. Akhenaten ruled in the 1300s BCE, so that's actually significantly older than that date, 7th century.
Of Zoroastrianism?
Yeah, of Zoroastrianism.
And I don't know for sure if there was another account before him of picking one god as being the god, but it's an interesting little aside of...
Yeah, and it seems almost like a political move on his part too.
That's what it seems.
This consolidation. What's also interesting about Egypt is, and this has been talked about a lot, but the parallels between Osiris and, the Semitic messianic figure, the Christ.
Yeah.
Right.
dies,
Death, rebirth,
death, rebirth. You find that all over the place in mythology. Cycle of 3 days, risen. In Osiris's case, he's led by Isis, who you can kind of see as a template for the Virgin Mary in Catholicism. Because the Virgin Mary is kind of almost deified in Catholicism. So really interesting parallels, and obviously Egypt was a neighbor of Judea, Israel, and Canaan, the Levant in general, and you could see those influences, which is pretty interesting.
And even if you look at the burgeoning Gnostic Christian community that was in Egypt, a lot of unique ideas came out of that from that group.
Absolutely. Egypt and Ethiopia, the early Gnostics, had enclaves, significant enclaves there. Really interesting too. A lot of these communities were purely egalitarian. They were organized along non-hierarchical lines. They were communal. Really interesting communities at that period of time. There was a lot of interesting stuff going on in Christianity before the Council of Nicaea.
Right.
Which is why they had to codify everything at the Council of Nicaea. Of course, it had to be politicized. That those kind of communities clearly are a threat to an empire like Rome.
Right.
So it's...
Yeah, they essentially just tried to solidify everything together. The Council of Nicaea is really where a lot of the bartering, I guess you could say, for lack of a better term, happened between some of the groups in deciding what books would be included in the Bible and which ones wouldn't be.
Right. That's where they decided on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Right. And
there's a ton of other Gospels that didn't make the cut.
And even certain parts of those Gospels were cut out.
Yeah, they picked their favorite versions as well. Because obviously all these Gospels, there's multiple versions.
Right.
That came from different communities, different Christian enclaves. So yeah, it's, that's yet another example, I guess, of, academic censorship.
Yep.
Academic politicization.
Yeah.
It's another shining example there.
Would you call it more academic, or would you call it more religious based during that time?
Well, obviously, I think the two things went hand in hand. The most learned people at the time
were religious, yeah.
Right, especially in the Christian community, and the people that were approached to be at the Council of Nicaea were obviously the most powerful and the most well-educated of the Christian, clergy of the time. With the exception of some of the radicals who didn't get to go to the council, But it does kind of remind you of a group of intellectuals, getting together, to discuss things from a certain point of view and to decide what, gets into something, what doesn't get into something. It's kind of like a club like the Council on Foreign Relations or something, where they invite certain people that they like their views into it, and they get to sit down and decide what's the basic policy for academic thinking in that respect.
Yeah, it is a perfect shining example of how a lot of humanity's best ideas started on the fringe.
Yeah.
I don't know too many revolutionary ideas that came out of the status quo. A lot of these ideas were rejected and ridiculed at the beginning. That's why I have such a keen interest in, when I study a religion, looking into their esoteric underground religions.
Right.
You could do that with any, obviously. Christianity, as we just said, was super interesting. Even Buddhism has a very rich esoteric underground, quote unquote, their word for it is tantric tradition to it. And all these things, one commonality among all the different esoteric traditions, they don't put the reliance on an external authority. They tell you to go experience it yourself, right?
Yeah, right.
And I think that was like one of the impulses that really kind of the Renaissance really kind of ran away with was that we're going to experiment and we're going to experience the truth for ourselves.
Right.
Let's experience the divine from within.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah, what unites all mystic traditions is the concept of revealed knowledge. You know, that you can't put these things into words. You have to actually experience, you know, it's that Gnostic idea of, you know, revelatory experience, or what we would call, you know, peak experiences now.
Right.
What a lot of philosophers or, you know, scientists would call peak experiences.
And we're going through a revival of that right now. We are going through a Gnostic revival.
We are.
No doubt. You know, starting in the 60s with the birth of psychedelics. And then, you know, I don't think it was no accident that when the psychedelics got out of the bag, a lot of these esoteric yogas and practices were being used along with them.
Transcendental meditation in the 50s and 60s, for example. You know, that came into the United States. You know, an increasing awareness of Eastern traditions in general in the United States and the West.
Right.
You know, yeah, definitely a resurgence in what
Shamanic.
you would shamanic. Yeah, especially very recently, a lot of really good, you know, shamanic work is out there. You know, I mean, Daniel Pinchbeck.
Yep.
You know, has done fantastic work. Terence McKenna, fantastic work in the shamanic traditions. Joseph Campbell. You know. So you have a lot of really interesting stuff going on when it comes to bringing back some of these things. And look at the resurgence of, like, you know, the Neo-Wicca, you know, and Neo-Pagan, you know, religions. You know, there's a big resurgence of that. You know, I think it's pretty interesting.
And in the people in the ivory towers, or the centralized authorities, so to speak, I always feel like a lot of these centralized authorities in academia are so reluctant to really acknowledge this. You know, you have like Richard Dawkins and such that are they're trying to push this idea of materialism on everybody.
Right.
You know, this ultra skepticism that there's nothing more than just the material meat realm we're all stuck in. You know. Yeah,
you know, it's this, you know, very, very bland, like, pseudo-intellectual atheism that seems to be all over the place. You know, you see it on the internet all the time. You know what I mean? This really just annoying atheist trend, you know. And I say this not because I don't like atheists or something like that. It's just that why does it have to be so militant and fundamentalist in a lot of cases?
Right.
You know, I mean, you have atheists just, you know, attacking people,
doing the same thing the church did.
Exactly, you know, and it's anti-intellectual, and it doesn't help anything.
And again, it's the people that want to experience things for themselves and are putting personal direct experience at the forefront are again the victims, are again the ones that are being witch hunted. You know, history has repeated itself numerous times throughout history on that one idea, that people that really go out of their way to enter these shamanic peak experiences are constantly being looked at with suspicion and are constantly enemies of the state or enemies of the establishment, just because I think that they're able to have access to the power and they're able to sort of skip over the whole authority figure giving it to them, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest problems, you know, when you look at this idea of the personal experience, a lot of people rope it in with this idea of New Age, which I hate that term so much. I think it diminishes what the experience is. And I think that's really the problem with that whole idea of the personal experience all throughout history, is that especially if you just want to look at modern examples, every time somebody talks about these things, you know, let's look at somebody like a Timothy Leary, a Terence McKenna, Alan Watts, people like this. A lot of times well, maybe not so much with McKenna, but especially with Ram Dass, Alan Watts, and Leary to a degree, they got labeled almost as gurus. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, they definitely... I mean, you got to have a big ego to begin with to be able to confidently assert some of these ideas. But I think that's one of the problems. I think the problem is that when you have experiences like people like that have, and you try and talk to people about it, I think a lot of people become fascinated by you instead of the experience itself.
Right. And
there is this, for some reason, well, it's because of so much of religion that the structure has had on people, this idea of a structuredized experience. So when these people were talking about the experiences they had, a lot of people were thinking, oh, you're such a great person. You must be right. I'm going to listen to everything you're saying instead of going out and trying to have the experience themselves. And it goes to the case with Christ and the teachings that he was giving. A lot of people, when we created an entire religion off of what he was teaching, and he wasn't trying to be this. He wasn't trying to create a church. He was just trying to explain to people these experiences you can have, and that's what a lot of these newer philosophers of the 20th century were doing. And I think the reason why a lot of times that gets written off is because you have the people who, instead of listening to what these people are saying and going out and doing it for themselves, are instead glorifying them in ways that aren't helping themselves personally move forward.
Right.
And I think a lot of it obviously has to deal with the establishment as well of organized religion. These people, if you have one of those types of experiences, you really don't have any use for an organized ritualistic event. When all these religions, their idea is enlightenment to become in the presence of the divine. But I have a hard time believing that every single person, if we have an organized type of religion, that every single person inside of that religion is going to quote unquote become enlightened through the practice of that religion. There's 7.4 billion people in the world today, which means there's 7.4 billion roads to enlightenment. Not one person is the same as the other person. Exactly. So you don't have the same experience as another person. Every person, we are all collectively experiencing this reality because of the perceptions that the human mind and the human consciousness has. But that doesn't mean that each one of us goes through this existence the same way. But we all are ultimately still going towards the same direction, which, for what we know for a fact, is death. And what happens after death is obviously left up to any sort of interpretation that any person can have. But if we want to just simply use the pre-existing ideas of religion and mysticism and all these other forms of explaining the divine, it seems to be a consensus that there is an energy, an essence, and even quantum physics talks about this. The essence of existence. There's this life force, for lack of a better word, and when you get in touch with that, you really understand the interconnectivity that you have with existence. And I think that scares established religions because it makes them not have as much power as what they have, because their belief system is based off of you showing up, doing the ritual, and going about it that way.
I think it ties into the larger themes we always talk about decentralization, and horizontal forms of authority, right? Giordano Bruno was charged with denying transubstantiation, right? This means you need the Catholic Church. You need to be part of the Catholic Church, because if you aren't, you cannot receive the actual Eucharist, because only an ordained priest of the Church can intercede on your behalf, take confession, and allow you the Eucharist, right? So you need that institution. Bruno was saying, no, that's not true. A lot of people during that time, Protestant Reformation, were saying, no, that's not true. This is a personal religious experience.
Okay? And that's why those ideas are so dangerous. Because you're right. It should be a personal experience. We don't need institutions to teach us about spirituality. Spirituality is already ingrained in the human experience. Exactly. You know, it's a Jungian archetype. Yeah. You know, I mean, it's buried in us.
And it's almost like these religions have, going back to an older word we always use, they've monopolized initiation. Like, if you go to a indigenous tribe, the initiation is personal. They're putting you out in the woods by yourself. And if you're lucky, maybe you'll have a few moments with the shaman beforehand or after. But it's a very personal thing, right? And I would say all mainstream institutional religions take that away. They say, oh, we're going to lead you through the initiation, and, you know, if you're lucky, you might make it and come to the other side of quote unquote death, or see what it is, why you're here, what you really are. And it's like they sort of just get you tied into this sort of shell game of their pseudo initiation process without ever actually getting to the meat or gnosis of it.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, exactly. You know, it kind of gets to be an act. I mean, you know, baptism, for example, is a form of initiation ritual. And it's usually a very simple process. I mean, you would go to a river or a baptismal pool. And even, like, you know, Indian civilization had this. And then you would be, you know, dunked in water, and depending on the tradition, it would wash you clean of sin, or you would be then reborn into the community of faith, right? Well, you know, I mean, you have organized religion that do this to babies, you know, just kind of to bring them in the family directly into the church. And then, you know, in Catholicism, and I think in Orthodox, you have to be confirmed, you know, at some point, you know, in your early teens.
Usually around 14.
Right. So that's a secondary ritual, you know. So, they do commodify, you know, and monopolize the initiation rituals, you know, which is
totally inverted from what its true purpose is.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing when you were talking about the natives, you know, was known as a vision quest.
Yeah.
You had a mystical vision, a profound vision of reality, and it's supposed to show you, you know, how you fit into existence. The thing about organized faith systems and religions is that it's a mechanical, it's a ritual, I'm sure that you can have a profound spiritual experience through ritual, and there's many accounts of people having that, but the mechanized religious activity, I don't see that as getting a person in touch with existence the way that a true vision quest, if you want to use that word, does. Especially with a standard religion practice of going to a church, listening to some scriptures read, doing various forms of ritual if you get communion, or you know, if you're in a Muslim church of kneeling and praying, and I think that those things help maybe to give people a sense of community.
Yeah.
But I mean, we seem to forget that we're all humans. We're all a part of a giant community of humans. And we're part of an even larger community known as the world, which is even a part of a larger community known as the entire universe. And I don't really see the need to continue to break that down any more than what it is. We're humans. We're apparently the only ones capable of speaking in the way here we are right now, having a conversation like this and articulating our thoughts the way we are. But we're still a part of the living community that is the Earth, which, if everything in the universe is quote-unquote alive to a certain degree, then all of this is part of one thing. So when we go and we make these religious institutions, it just breaks down and creates barriers and divides, and that's really, I think that's the reason why so much of the issues that we're under are because we're dividing these people. We're dividing people into groups that don't actually exist, and I think I would be willing to bet that the vast majority of people who are in a religious community never have a truly profound experience inside of their religion in their entire lives. I would be willing to bet that the vast majority of them is very mechanized, and it's just something that gets them. It's whatever helps them sleep at night is really what it comes down to.
And in a sense, they fear it. They fear an actual, authentic spiritual experience.
Well, they read about it in their books. You know, you read about Christ or Muhammad or Buddha or any other prophet of a religion. They have these profound experiences. They come in touch with the divine. And I don't think people today even understand what that is. I think, you know, when you hear somebody today say that they have an experience like that, it usually just gets written off in a lot of ways, especially in the religious communities in a lot of circumstances. And to me, that shows a disconnect with what you even are believing to begin with. When somebody, because it's almost it's like who was the disciple when Jesus appeared back to the disciples that wasn't there and said, "I'll believe it when I see it." Who was the? Was it Thomas?
I think it might have been Thomas.
I believe it was Thomas. Well, that seems to be the way that we as a society are operating, is this show me. Well, you can't show someone a divine experience that you have. It's inside of you. It's your experience. Someone can't look through your eyes. Only you can see through your own eyes and through your own mind. So, you know, when you have an experience like that, and you try and tell someone, well, you know, I had whatever experience it was. People seem to not want to believe that. And I think that's because they have all it written out for them. They have their book. They have their church or temple or mosque or whatever they go to. And that is their religious experience. And the mystical, profound experience doesn't register to them in the way that it does for the person who actually has the experience.
And we have an entire civilization, quote unquote, on this planet that have 95% of them haven't had these experiences. And in my opinion, if you haven't had one of these experiences, you don't know what it's all about. You know, you're going through an entire life without having any idea truly what it's all about to be alive.
Sure. You know, the purpose of religion and spirituality in the end is to provide some kind of comfort, you know, to provide some kind of, you know, to fill a void within a human being, you know. And I don't think a lot of the mainstream religions are doing that. I think you go to church, especially, you know, in the West, you sit there on Sunday or Friday or Saturday or whatever your day is, and you hear the sermon and you feel, you know, a sense of community while you're there, then you leave and that evaporates. You don't think about it for a week. And I think that's, you know, the tragedy of institutionalized religion, because you should be living with that every day, no matter what your tradition is. You know, you should be living with that comfort and that sense of community and kinship all the time. You know, that's what revealed wisdom's about.
Right.
You know, and it's actually practicing and having experiences, profound, transcendent experiences. You know, because we're capable of those experiences. Why shouldn't you have them?
Correct, right.
You know.
And it was, you know, going back to the indigenous cultures, it was like the whole vision quest or initiatory process allowed one to become an individual, but it wasn't just becoming an individual. It was recognizing how them as an individual fit into the tribe. So it did both roles, right? And that's just it. By us not having this experience, we truly can't, I guess, synchronize with everyone else around us. We're going to be constantly at conflict because we don't really see how everything fits together.
Well, when you look, when I look at the idea of the Vision Quest, it was primarily, we're talking about Native Americans here. It's primarily boys that did the experience. So what they would say was, when the person came back, they say the boy has died, the man has returned, and it was a rite of passage into adulthood, into being a productive member of the society, and being integrated into the society in that way. In the Western world, we really don't have a rite of passage. You could say at 18, you can vote. At 21, you can drink. Neither one of those things to me seem like any sort of rite of passage in a communal, better understanding of existence and how you fit into existence. I don't see how voting or being able to drink poison really makes you a upstanding member of society. And it really, the thing about that is, we were talking about earlier with religions, the confirmation practice in Catholicism, that's supposed to integrate you into the community, but it's this artificial type of practice. You have like a bar mitzvah for the Jewish faith, quinceañeras in the Mexican traditions, but they're very artificial from what I've seen and been a part of, where it doesn't have that organic feel to it. It just seems to be a very robotic repetition of the ritual. It's not really understood the point of why they're even doing it anymore. It just seems to be, well, this is what you're supposed to do at this age, so this is what we're doing.
If you think about it, a lot of our initiation rituals, then, if you want to call them that, are built around institutions. I mean, look at your graduation party when you turn 18. Oh, well, great. You graduated through our, terribly, woefully lacking educational system. Congratulations, now you can vote and buy a pack of cigarettes. I don't think that's a real initiation ritual. You're right. I read an article recently about bar mitzvahs, where a lot of rabbis are saying, these bar mitzvahs or bad mitzvahs are getting out of control. I mean, people are spending thousands of dollars on these huge, lavish parties for like a 13-year-old.
It becomes a status symbol,
right?
In a lot of ways.
Look at those Sweet 16 parties.
Exactly.
I mean, that's just what you turn 16 years old. I mean,
it's almost
you're having this materialistic, wild party for a 16-year-old girl. I mean, what?
It seems almost that these rites of passage of the face, and then like a thing with the Sweet 16, it's you're being ushered into consumerism more so than you are into being integrated into being a good member of society. You're being integrated into being a good capitalist, fulfilling member of society is really what this seems to be. Because when a 16-year-old kid, and a lot of you get him a brand new car, or these you throw him some lavish party where some celebrity is coming and singing, and I mean, how is that getting, really all that's doing is making this person feel here's a child, they feel entitled at this point, they feel so important. In the grand scheme of society, no one person is really all that important. So it's supposed to be a humbling act. When you're a child, especially an infant, you feel like the entire world revolves around you. You can't even comprehend another person's state of opinion and viewpoint of the world. And then as you get older, you slowly start to see how the world doesn't revolve around you, and how there's a much larger scale of the world. When you have parties like this where it seems to be this self-fulfilling actions that a lot of these events are. Because even when you turn 21, I mean, what does the average person do in America? They go out and they just get completely drunk. It's all about them. It's and even birthdays in general. It's
kind of a selfish.
Yeah, it's it's a self-indulging actions instead of, when you go out and you have in ancient times of the Vision Quest with the Native Americans, it was about shattering your psyche. It was about shattering your individuality and seeing that you are nothing in the grand scheme of reality, and then building that back together to be a humbled individual, to realize that, yes, I am an individual, but I am part of something far greater than I ever thought was possible before this. And I don't see that. I don't see anything in our modern day society.
It does the opposite.
Close. Exactly. Yeah.
The polar opposite. It worships the ego. It worships self-indulgence without actually showing how the ego fits with the collective. Totally dramatically the polar opposite of the Vision Quest, and that's most likely one of the reasons why we're in the situation we're in.
Sure.
There is no sensitivity to how we affect everything around us. It is a total self-indulgent clusterfuck, for lack of a better word.
And it really,
the cult of consumerism. The biggest religion of the world is, the Church of Capitalism.
Yep.
And it is sort of, it all goes back, when we were talking about Bruno in the beginning. Bruno talked about the Copernican model of heliocentrism, of these planets and the sun not revolving around the Earth, but us revolving around the sun, and then taking it a step further and saying, there's a whole lot more out than what we think there is, and it diminishes the representation of the individual being as important as they think they are. Us, when we thought that we on the Earth were so much more important than what we really are in the grand scheme of the universe.
Absolutely.
So it's fascinating that really all we've done is sort of switch the model of looking at the individual as being important. It's went from looking at the Earth that we are the be all end all to now almost each individual somehow is the be all end all, which is I don't know what that really says about us moving forward, but I guess as long as we have social media and tablets and little doodads, that's moving us forward, I guess.
Well, but I also think that there is a very real impulse for this authentic initiatory process that people are yearning for. I think this is evident through the mass rates of depression. A lot of people just aren't happy, and these are people with a lot of material goods and a lot of money and happy families and quote unquote successes, and they're just not happy. They're not fulfilled because they haven't fully transcended their ego and recognized how it all fits together. Yeah.
I firmly believe that we are probably for the last 100 years or so, certainly since the 50s, in a period of mass existential crisis in the Western countries. Consumerism, this culture that we've built, just leaves this massive void, and they try to fill it with products, and they try to fill it with antidepressants, chemicals and poisons. Our environment is poisonous now. I think it's existentially a real crisis on our mass psyche that we don't have these things, and I think it's important to do something about it.
Right. Oh, you're not happy? Well, buy more stuff. That'll make you happier.
Right.
Buy.
Right.
Yeah, it ruins the individual experience when you have this model, this model of consumerism, this model of feeding the ego. Because I think, like you were saying, a lot of these people who do get successful in the terms that society deems successful, then they realize that they're not really all that successful in knowing who they are as a person. And I think that's why I think that's why you see a lot of celebrity type people going and partying a lot, and they're almost hiding from the creation of who they are, the character that they play. and they don't really know who they are because they're what they've created or what the society has created them to be. And even with bankers and things like that, they're considered to be these powerful moguls of finance, and that doesn't necessarily mean that's who they are as a person.
Right.